Next, we're going to talk about action therapies with a focus on behavioral action therapies. So behavioral action therapies are focused on behaviorism, which, as you'll remember, is going back to Skinner, Watson, and Pavlov. So it's focused on the classical and operant conditioning principles that we learned about at the very beginning of the semester. The goal of behavioral therapies is to change disordered behavior and is not particularly concerned with the original cause of such behavior. That's more in the realm of insight therapies. Action therapies are all about doing rather than thinking. So let's first talk about some classical conditioning therapies. If you'll remember, classical conditioning is all about reflexes and automatic associations between different things. Phobias can be thought of as something that can be classically conditioned. If you'll remember the story of little Albert, who's made to be afraid of the white rabbit and then also other things that were white and fuzzy, that was because he associated those things with a loud, startling noise. We can think of phobias as developing in a similar sort of way, as somehow associating a stimulus with a fear response as an automatic reflex, and that if we think about it as an automatic reflex, we can also condition it away. So systematic desensitization is one of the ways that is used to treat phobias, and it's very effective. I'm going to link you to a video about a gentleman who has a fear of baked beans, and you're going to get to see systematic desensitization at work. So one of the things that people tend to do in this type of therapy is they first make a list of all the things that they're afraid of. I'm going to show you a list in a little bit. And then they're taught to relax while concentrating on those fears. The key here is that they're basically replacing an old conditioned response with a new one. So before, those particular stimuli or thoughts would lead to a fear response. But if you concentrate on those fears while you're relaxing, you can replace that fear response with a different response. And that's the key. One of the things that we found is that phobias can be basically something that can be reinforced through avoidance. If you avoid the source of the fear, then that reinforces the connection between fear and the stimuli in question, because avoiding it makes you feel good. So addressing it, looking at it, approaching it, and interacting with it is the best possible way to treat phobias, especially doing so while calm, because if you do so when you're calm, then you lose that fear response. Exposure therapy is a part of systematic desensitization where people are gradually exposed to the source of their fear under safe conditions where no escape is possible. So they might start by thinking about the source of their fear and then looking at pictures of the source of their fear and then gradually approaching a point where they are interacting with the source of their fear. The key thing is, once again, that it's under safe conditions where no escape is possible so that avoidance can't be reinforced. Sometimes people have found that use of virtual reality, for example, can be an incredibly effective way to immerse yourself in exposure to a particular fearful stimuli while knowing that it's absolutely safe and not real. The key is to dissociate the fear response from the stimulus, which once again requires extinction training, which means that you get exposed to the stimulus without having a fear response enough times. Then that can eventually gradually lead you to not experience a fear response in future because it's been dissociated through extinction. This is an example from your textbook where someone has made a list of various things that they fear and have rated their fear level from 10 to 100, or in this case 0 to 100. And what you would do is start with the bottom of the list and work your way up to the top and focus on each one of those things and try to concentrate on them while relaxing. Flooding is rarely used, but this would be a rapid and intense exposure to the source of fear without being able to avoid it. Sometimes people do this themselves. So for example, someone who might have a fear of heights might decide to go jump out of a plane or bungee jump. Someone who is afraid of a particular type of animal might surround themselves with the animal as a way to flood them and to prevent escape and therefore expose them to the source of their fear as a way to reduce it. I would say this should probably be carefully done and shouldn't be done without the full agreement of the individual in question. So it's something that has to be done with the person fully on board. So once again, if you're afraid of water, jumping into a pool of water would be an example of literal flooding. Aversion therapy is where an undesirable behavior is paired with aversive stimuli. Now, it's important to understand that we've already talked extensively about how punishment has its limits, and that if it's done to extremes, that it can often lead to unintended side effects in terms of increasing anxiety and guilt and shame, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But punishment should be very carefully administered. In this particular case, for example, these sorts of therapies tend to be the most effective where the person in question is fully on board and where it's associated with a specific behavior that you want to reduce. Rapid smoking therapy is a form of smoking cessation therapy where the person in question, hello, yes, where the person in question smokes a lot of cigarettes in a row and then makes themselves sick. Because as we've known from classical conditioning models, nausea can be a very powerful deterrent. Disulfiram, also known as antabuse, is a particular drug that sometimes people take when they're struggling with stopping to drink alcohol. And basically what it does is if you take the pill every day and then you take a single sip of alcohol, it'll make you violently ill. And once again, the association between nausea and that particular thing is a deterrent. And this is once again best used when the person is in full agreement and is basically doing it to themselves as a way to keep them from engaging in this behavior. Conversion therapy is a rather terrible therapeutic approach where people are shocked and punished when exposed to gay therapy and gay stimuli in an attempt to convert them into being straight. This is shown as being incredibly ineffective and harmful. It leads to spikes in suicide, and it's banned in several states for good reason. It's completely ineffective, and it's terrible. This is another thing to be wary of. Unstudied and untested and unvalidated therapies. The American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Pediatric Association all say that conversion therapy is terrible and is ineffective and is proven by research to not work. So I would say be wary of therapies that claim to be therapies and make sure that research has been done that it's a valid approach and that it actually works. Let's get into more operant conditioning approaches. So if you remember, classical conditioning is about reflexes. Operant conditioning is about using reward in order to shape more complex behaviors. So token economy is something we've already talked about. That's where tokens are accumulated in exchange for desired items or privileges. Like if you read so many books, you get a gold star, and if you get enough gold stars by the end of the semester, you'll get a pizza party. A contingency contract is another example of reinforcement where basically a client and a therapist sit down and write a formal written agreement about a planned set of behaviors, and the goals are clear, reinforcements and penalties are clear, and it basically provides an external accountability so that the client is more likely to go through with a behavior because they've written it down and they've signed it and someone else is keeping abreast of their progress. If you'll remember from the Skinner reading, extinction is the most effective way of stopping behavior compared to punishment. So extinction is vastly preferable to punishment when you're attempting to stop a behavior, and that involves the removal of a reinforcer. The simplest way of thinking about this is a timeout, that the person is removed from the situation that provides reinforcement for undesirable behavior. I'm a big fan of Super Nanny. She does a lot of really great things. I linked to a clip of her last week when we were talking about body image, and I'm going to link to another clip of her exhibiting this extinction approach in order to lead to behavior change, so you can see how that is in practice. The people who are most likely to benefit from this type of behavioral therapy would be when there's a very specific issue. So behavioral therapies are excellent at addressing things like bedwetting, addiction, and phobia. More severe disorders that have troubling behavioral symptoms can often benefit from a behavioral therapy approach. So for example, people who have challenges with self-harm and with purging can find that behavioral therapeutic approaches can help address that specific behavior to reduce it and therefore reduce the harm to themselves. As a reminder, however, one of the distinct challenges with a behavioral approach is that while it addresses behavior, it does not address the underlying cause of that behavior. So it's not interested in why something has come up, just interested in solving it. And that could be, once again, a potential downside to this particular therapeutic approach.